I want to bring in immigration lawyer Dayo Fadino, who joins me now from London. Dayo, thank you for joining me on the program. I know we've had this back and forth as it concerns migration and immigration into European countries and the UK and so on. So this discrimination, which is what it is, it's been making headlines, since this war started, and refugees have been leaving Ukraine, fleeing into neighboring countries. You see the response is different, right? There seems to be provision and preparation, for these refugees. But if you look back to 2015, when the migration started from or reignited from African countries in the Middle East, there was no preparation such as the ones being received now, and the reception was different.
That's correct. Good afternoon. What is actually happening right now is very, very concerning, really. We have a situation where the laws to do with refugees is quite clear. And we also have laws and rules in place, especially the rules that were promulgated early this month to do with the European Union Temporary Protection Directive that was passed by the EU concerning third-party nationals. And it made it very, very clear that, well, this rule applies to Ukrainians, no doubt, but that rule also, that very particular directive also stated that anybody fleeing conflict from Ukraine should be allowed, a safe passage, and there should also be humanitarian access to anybody from a third-party country. But it seems this very particular directive is not being applied to particularly foreigners at all. I'm talking specifically about Africans. And what is now happening is the moment an African or a foreigner that is not a Ukrainian manages to get to the border, either crossing over to Poland or Estonia, I think another country is also Austria, they are now being picked up and being, slammed in jail, really, put in detention centers, which is not right. That's quite discriminatory. It's very cruel. Here are people who have third-party nationals who are trying to actually escape the conflict in Ukraine. And the moment they manage now to cross over to any of the countries, they are now being, locked up, which is illegal, because it's very clear that the rules to do with refugees, you cannot lock up anybody fleeing from persecution from another country or fleeing from conflict from another country. So it's not particularly proper at all for this to be happening. And I plead, and I would appeal and plead to the relevant authorities, particularly the IOM, and even the African High Commissions and embassies to intervene. This is not right, it's illegal, and it falls within the remit of illegal detention, really, for many of these African refugees, the African people who are fleeing the war-torn area in Ukraine.
Yes, and I know that this appeal from the UN Refugee Agency covers not just the Ukrainian crisis, it covers all sorts of crises around the world, especially those who are fleeing conflicts in Africa. And Africa itself has been undergoing a political instability, so people are fleeing that as well, for fear that there could be insecurity breaking out. But once again, back to the refugee situation at the borders. A lot of African students had problems trying to cross from Ukraine into neighboring countries. Poland, I think, took the brunt of that because they were not allowing anyone of African descent into Poland. They eventually apologized and said, they were working towards that. The Nigerian government also, had to intervene at some point, to make sure that, people were able to leave. But what are the rights, that these refugees have, as they cross the border? It's one thing to have your rights, of course, but it's another thing for the other side to recognize those rights. So where do they meet?
That's correct. Well, you see, there are two types of regulations that apply to any refugee, particularly in this very particular instance of third-party nationals crossing over to other countries, and fleeing this very particular conflict. We have the European Union Temporary Protection Directive, which was put together when the war started, and that very particular directive states very clearly that people should be allowed that safe passage. Anybody fleeing from wars from this very particular war in Ukraine should be allowed to pass on to any other country that they would feel safe if they should actually cross over. Then we also have the UN Convention, the 1951 UN Convention to do with refugees, which again states very clearly that in a war-torn country, anybody fleeing the war situation as a refugee should be allowed, the moment that person crosses over to another country, that person should be allowed, the basic humanitarian access, facilities, should not be treated unfairly, should not be jailed and not be locked up. But it seems Africans, particularly the African students and the African professionals who are living in Ukraine before the war started, many of them are not even allowed to cross over to countries like Hungary or Poland or Estonia. In fact, there have been situations where Africans now want to cross over, they'll be pushed back. In fact, there were some Africans who were pushed back to go back to Ukraine and go and fight for Ukraine. Join the war in Ukraine to actually start fighting for Ukraine. These people are not Ukrainians. They are students. They are third-party nationals, and they have the right, like any other Ukrainian, to flee to flee the war-torn situation in Ukraine. They are not meant to be pushed back. So, in fact,
how do they stand? How do they stand for their rights? I mean, they know this. Well, they know this. You know what you're saying. They do, and the international community also knows. And these countries you're mentioning, they also know. So, how do the students stand their ground?
Well, they would then just have to make it very clear to the Polish authorities, to the the Hungarian authorities, the Estonian authorities, that look, these are rights under international law. You cannot lock us up. And the moment they start locking them up, putting them in detention centers, they also have the right to sue that very particular government, putting them in detention centers. And they should make the authorities understand that shouldn't be happening at all. What the authorities should be doing, Poland or Estonia, what they should be doing is trying to facilitate the third party nationals getting in touch with the embassies for them to at least return to their country of origin. They cannot be locking them up. They are not criminals. They are people fleeing persecution, and they should really, really make it very clear that, look, if you persist with this, detaining us, we may have no choice but to sue you for illegal detention. We are not meant to be in prison. We are meant to be protected under the international law, under the UN Convention, the 1951 UN Convention for Refugees, and the current European temporary directive, is protecting refugees fleeing from Ukraine. They are not meant to be locked up. This is discrimination. And I also want to believe that our governments, African governments, African embassies, high commissions should intervene and bang that very, very big drum that, look, this is not on. It shouldn't be happening at all. You need to protect our nationals until they could actually return to their countries of origin. You are not meant to be locking them up at all. They are not criminals. They are fleeing water. Sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but while that is really clear, that these people should be given the opportunity to come back home. I believe that the Nigerian government did give some of these students, well, lots of them, the opportunity to come back home. So some decided to stay back, some decided to stay in these other countries. Are they responsible for their own upkeep, or should they still depend on the Nigerian government to help them, as they try to resettle in these other countries?
Well, resettle in these other countries, the moment you've been given the possibility of going back to your country of origin, and you've now decided to stay in Poland or any of these other countries that you feel safe, except you have a very strong case of asylum, that you have the right to be able to stay in, let's say, Poland or Estonia or any of these countries based on an asylum application. If you have a very strong asylum case that you cannot turn to your country of origin because you fear persecution, yes, you may have that right to be able to stay in any of these countries. But if you do not have that, if you cannot make the case of persecution for any reason, political, social, religious, national reasons, if you cannot make that case, you are meant to go back to your country of origin. So if you decide to stay, you'll be doing that at your own risk, really, because if you do not have a case of asylum, how would you be able to stay? I know of some students who are now trying to continue with their studies in some of these countries that are accommodating them at this point. Students who are medical students who feel that maybe they could actually continue with their studies in Poland, if it's possible. And if the authority actually allows this to happen, that would be good. But if not, it will be very, very tough if they've decided to remain and not want to return to their countries of origin.
That's a tough one, isn't it? So they only have two choices now from what you're saying. They can either decide to come back to Nigeria or they can decide to apply for asylum. But, the issue of us, if they have
that right to apply for asylum, take for instance, the only way you could apply for asylum is if you could make the very, very strong case that you fear persecution if you return to your country of origin. Political persecution, religious, social group, if you belong to a social group that is not tolerated in Nigeria, for instance, or any of the other African countries, yes, you could apply for asylum. But if you do not have that case of asylum, it will be very, very difficult for you to apply for that asylum. Because if you do apply for asylum and you don't have a case, there's a very high probability that that application will be refused in any of the European countries. But short of that, it will be difficult for any African or any foreigner, for that matter, third-party national, to remain in Poland or any of the other countries. There's a limit to what the NGOs, protecting people fleeing from Ukraine can do. If you are a third-party national, yes, you fled persecution, but the fact still remains that you need to now find a way of going back to your country of origin. You cannot stay in Poland or Hungary if you do not have a case of asylum. Humanitarian reasons, yes. If there could be exceptional reasons as to why the authorities of any of these countries would want to allow you to stay, but short of exceptional, compassionate reasons, that person, a third-party national, might not have the right to be able to stay in Poland or any of the other EU countries.
Indeed. I just wanted to ask just very quickly, maybe we're being too hard, on these European countries. I talked about the influx at the beginning, of migrants coming into the continent. They had a hard time settling into many countries in Europe. So probably the preparation or maybe the fear here is that, these Africans will come in and will not be willing to leave. So that probably also has to be a cap on the number of migrants you could allow into your country at a certain period of time, right?
Yes, I take the point, but you see, it's not the case that the Africans decided to leave Ukraine and to cross over to countries like Poland or Estonia. We have a war situation where everybody is fleeing. And if we have this war situation where everybody is fleeing, again, I make reference to the Geneva Convention, the UN Geneva Convention 1951, regarding refugees. These Africans, these students, these professionals who happen to be Africans, they fall within the ambit of refugees. And if they've now crossed over to another country, they're entitled to humanitarian protection. They're also entitled to the facilities to make them at least the basic rights to be able to live as human beings. They cannot be discriminated against. We cannot be saying that, well, we would accept Ukrainians as refugees, but as far as any other nationality is concerned, just based on the color of your skin, we are not going to be giving you the same facilities or the same humanitarian protection. That's discriminatory, it's racist. If we have to actually call it the name it truly is. They should at least give them the basic human rights to be able to at least live within these countries that they are at this point until they could either go back to their country of origin, or if there are exceptional, compelling, compassionate reasons why they should remain in Poland, Estonia, or any other European country. It's not proper that they should be put in detention. They have not put any Ukrainian in detention. Right. So why third-party nationals? It's not right. I mean, because we are talking of the same human beings here. We are all human beings with basic fundamental human rights, particularly to do with this situation, to do with the Ukrainian situation, where we have a war-torn country and people are running away from that country to somewhere else for safety. You cannot be treating nationals differently.
Dayo Fadino, thank you so much for speaking with us. This is, a pretty touchy topic to be exploring, especially as there's still a war going on the other side, of the fence. Thank you again for joining us on the program.
It's a pleasure, Amarachi. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.